Hello, thanks for joining me. I'm going to try to keep this stream short, maybe 10 to 15 minutes. The goal of the stream is to show how you can use the Promise API in order, or Promise objects in JavaScript to chain multiple promises in a row without getting into that pyramid of doom, or also known as callback hell. So what we're going to do is use the Fetch API to send an AJAX request and add some data to this table here in the HTML. It's hidden using opacity of 0. Right now, using a little bit of Bootstrap just to get some quick styling up and running. So right now we have some basic HTML in this, and if we go to app.js, there's some functions just for showing the table and adding user data. So what we're going to do next is write a function which fetches some users. So we'll call the function fetch users. And this function is going to use the fetch API to send an AJAX request using the random user API. And then once we get the response from that, we're going to show how, or I'm going to show you can use the fetch API with promise chaining. Eventually, I'm going to first show it without promise chaining. And then eventually we'll take that random user data and add it to the table. So first up, we're going to send AJAX request to user API. Then we need to handle or check if the response is okay. If response is okay, if it is, so we'll get rid of check to say if the response is okay, we want to parse the body and then render users. If response is not okay, then we're gonna go ahead and we'll just cop out and just alert something went wrong. Simple as that. So if you want to learn more about the Fetch API, I highly recommend going on to the Mozilla Developer Network and search for the Fetch API. And there's a nice guide there. W3 Schools also usually has pretty good tutorials, and I believe they cover the Fetch API. So I recommend, if you want to learn more about the Fetch API, check that out. This demo is really not about the Fetch API, but rather showing how you can use promise chaining to avoid callback hell. So first things first, let's send our fetch request. So we're going to fetch, and then our URL is for the random user API. Go to the random user API. It's pretty handy when you're just doing some examples or trying something out. If we go to the documentation and look up request multiple users, there's our URL. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. We don't want 5,000 users. I think 5 is plenty. Now the Fetch API works with promises, which means that when I call fetch, it returns something called a promise. Now a promise is an object with a couple of methods that are really useful for handling asynchronous code. So .then will get called, accepts a callback function, like so, and that will get called when the fetch, when the AJAX request response is received. If there's an error and something goes wrong, the other thing that a promise provides with is a catch method. Now here then returns a promise as well, which is why we can use catch. So if something goes wrong, then our then code doesn't run, or if something goes wrong during execution of then, it's going to break out of any future thens and end up running the callback that we passed to .catch. So .catch handles the error. So we'll go ahead and do some error handling here. I'm going to console log the error for now, and then just alert something didn't work out. Okay, simple as that. We look here, it looks like everything's okay. Let's go ahead and take the response from the Fetch API. We can console log the response. And now when the page loads, we'll just call fetch users. And we can see that we got our response. Now the Fetch API returns a promise, and then what you need to do is that the promise resolves without having an error, even if the response is an error. So what you're going to want to do with the fetch API is first say if response.ok, which will be true if it was not an error response. So if we got a response in the 200s, for instance. And then we can continue on. So the next step would be this API returns JSON. If we look at headers here, let's go ahead and console log response dot headers. Oh, something didn't work out. I used that wrong. I think headers might be a function. Nope, memory is failing me right now. Let's just console log response again and look at proto response. So we want to get headers. And I'm going to go ahead and call entries. Response.headers.entries. See how that works out. Go. Console log those. You know what? Skip that. What I want to do is check for a content type, but I'm pretty sure this API gives us a content type of JSON data. We can make sure by looking here in the network tab and see that. Let's see, response headers, content type, application JSON. Perfect. So if response is okay, in order to parse, so right now our response needs to be parsed, and since it's a JSON response, I can use response.json, which also returns a promise, which means we got to chain another .then on the end, and then pass another function, which is going to get the parsed data. And now if I console.log data, go look in the console here, we're going to see that data is this object with results on it. So I'm going to go ahead and take results data.results.for each, and we're going to go ahead and call append user row for each result. And when that's done, I'm going to call show table. Great, perfect. Now you can see we have a little bit of callback hell starting out because I had to do with this inner .then inside the .then, and that can actually be avoided with the way promises work. So what you can do is if your callback past a .then returns a promise, then you can chain another .then on the end, which will wait for the previous promise to resolve, right? So you can have another asynchronous function here. So in order to do that, right here where I'm chaining my .then, I want to go ahead and take this .then out, like so. So I want to just cut that. Oops, cut too much perhaps, yep. So I want to cut all that and chain it onto the end here. So now I need to make sure, so this won't work. This function will only receive undefined right now because the function I passed to the previous .then doesn't return anything. Now I can return response.json, which produces a promise, which means the next .then will first wait for that to resolve, and then it will pass the result of that promise, the data, to my next callback in the chain. And now we don't have callback hell. See how I don't have the callback within a callback within a callback anymore. And that really cleans things up. Now the other thing we want to watch out for is if the response is not okay, this function returns undefined again, which means we jump right to this function, but data will be undefined, and that's a problem. So what I'm going to go ahead and do here is if response is not okay, I'm just going to go ahead and throw I'm going to throw a new error. We're just going to say the request, or actually let's just take response dot status text. We'll just throw the status text for now, which is fine. Okay, and we have an error. So let's see, where did I go wrong? Didn't like something I did. Looks like, well, that's odd. All of a sudden I'm getting a CORS error. Worked before. Well, that was random from random user. Thanks for that. But here we go. Everything's working again. My guess is one of the images that was received probably didn't start with HTTPS, and that might be where the error came from. But I'm not entirely certain, so we're not going to worry about it. But there you go. That's how you can take promises, and by having one promise, one callback in your .then, return another promise. That allows you to chain another promise onto the end. So if I needed to do more asynchronous work, I could continue chaining on more .thens, and there you have it.